for anyone, woo. All right. So for anyone who's unfamiliar, which I definitely was, I had no idea what this was before getting into this consulting stuff. It's a super in-depth behavioral interview. And you've probably heard about behavioral interviews broadly at lots of different kinds of jobs and other things. And yeah, that's all well and good. This one's really unique, which is why we're spending this whole session talking about it. It's generally about 30 minutes long, paired with the case study. And instead of talking at a high level about an experience you'll have, you'll spend that 30-minute block in depth focused on one, maybe two, usually just one experience. And it's designed to complement what they test in the case study, which we'll talk about exactly what it's testing in the coming slides. But it's a great way for them to get to know you better, how you would operate as a consultant, and make sure this is a place where you'll thrive and get a lot out of this job. Ben, would you add anything on this?
No, I just think of it as one other thing you just mentioned here is like, I just think of this as a behavioral interview, but harder and more in depth. And I think one good thing about preparing for the PEI, at least in my experience, is once you get good enough to get through this interview, you can feel pretty equipped to go into just about any behavioral interview for like life for a significant period of time. So I think
Yep, spot on. Also, don't be shy about throwing questions in the chat. We love the interactive nature of this. Ben, you want to take this one?
Yeah, so it's nice to see the cumulative like 4 or 5 years of McKinsey experience manifesting in this extraordinary slide here. I think PEI behavioral, this is perfectly laid out. Like it is coding for different things in the case. The case is can you do the job? The PEI is, do we want to do the job with you? And I think how will you operate on a team? Are you a resourceful person? Are you the type of person that can figure things out and navigate ambiguity? These are the types of things they're looking for in a behavioral interview. And I think that the reason that they go into in-depth questions, or rather into your stories in depth and do 1 or 2 as opposed to like 5 or 6 surface level questions, is because these traits are really actually kind of hard to figure out. If you ask like a couple of like 3-minute answer style questions, you're going to get a bunch of polished responses from a bunch of smart people, and you're never actually going to get to the bottom of how they think how other people think, how they feel, how they think about how other people feel. So a lot of this stuff is a little bit more challenging to do at the surface level. And so McKinsey in particular likes to dig pretty deep, and you'll see that in the example today.
Yeah, my overwhelming feeling when I look at this after doing the job is the interview for consulting makes so much sense. Like the case interview is one thing that you're all familiar with at this point to some level. And then these traits, these behavioral traits, are actually what you need to do the job well, because you can do quick math all day long. It's one thing to be right. It is a whole other ballgame to convince people you are right and get them to take your advice. That is just a completely different set of skills. And so and you're going to encounter so many different challenging personal experiences, right? Just thinking about what consulting is, you get thrown into new teams, new environments all the time, often with people who maybe their boss didn't think they could do this job, so you're being brought in to do it instead. Just imagine all of these situations. And that's why these are the traits that matter. And that's why they're testing for these things, because they need you to be able to navigate conflict, to be proactive, to be able to think on your feet. And that's exactly why this interview is the way it is. Alrighty. So some example questions that just to give you an idea of the type of thing they might ask would be something like a situation when you disagreed with someone at work. What happened? How is it resolved? Or a time when you took on a project outside of your scope. Working with diverse teams, experiences where you had a major change and had to adapt, because you will 100%, with 100% certainty, you'll have to do all of these things when you're a consultant. One that I had that was a total curveball was tell me about a time when you had to meet a tough deadline, which, yeah, I didn't really prep for that one. Kept me off guard. Ben, did you have any that?
Yeah, I think one of the questions we might go through, which Missy may or may not know beforehand, is something I got on my interview day too. I think a natural like follow-on question, which is either in the chat or will be in the chat at some point, is like, how do I prepare for all these different variants of questions? And something I think just to say up front while we're here is thinking about stories from your life that are complex, that are nuanced, that have many layers to them, and that are happening at inflection points in your life or in your company's work life, on teams, thinking about transition points that cover a lot of ground and that can be used for multiple different scenarios. I think those are the types of stories worth fleshing out, because you cannot memorize or come up with answers to 400 different permutations of questions, but you can come up with useful heuristics and stories that do in fact cover a lot of ground. And that comes with practice. That comes with getting feedback from people as you practice your stories, the same way you might practice cases. So that's all I would layer on.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And we'll talk through more like just what the bar is as far as prep, because I think it's all well and good when people at a high level say, yeah, think of stories that cover all these bases, but like, we actually want you guys to like know what the bar is and help you get to that bar, so that you feel really prepared going into one of these. It's not just thinking about the experience at a high level. No, you need to be recounting the story, specifically what happened. And you'll see when Ben grills me later what it might be like. I'm a little scared. I probably should have prepped more, but you really want to go through the exercise of writing out at a minimum in bullet points, just like what actually happened. And at a maximum, even like fully writing it out and practicing telling those stories to your friends, to your roommates, to your siblings, whoever.
Missy,
I see.
I wanted to answer the question in the chat, because it's
Yes.
you're almost phrasing the question such that it's impossible to answer, in the sense that I think these questions are designed actually. And when I went through my own interview training, these questions are supposed to be broad enough at first glance so that anybody from any walk of life can do them. And we're talking anyone from like a military sergeant, to somebody who's worked exclusively in corporate America, to somebody straight out of undergrad who may only have a couple internships worth of experience. These same questions are realistically applied across all these settings. And so I actually reject the notion that you don't have any experience that can be used for this. Just about every question, like even an entrepreneurial drive experience. Before like this year, I had never started a business. Like that's fine. But I can talk about times when I've hustled, or times when I've actually figured out like small resourceful ways in my life to make something out of nothing. And I think that would be a perfectly valid answer that would function equally well in an interview to somebody who might have started a fully fledged business. So I think even if you don't have like the most obvious answer, this is where that prep comes in, and you actually have to do some searching beforehand to find what answers might function well, for questions which might not be so easily a fit for you.
And it doesn't have to be your job either. I think that's an important component here. They're testing for personality traits, and maybe a specific trait hasn't shown up a lot in your primary place of work or education, but it probably has shown up outside of that in extracurriculars, in other things you've navigated. I remember interviewing folks, especially undergrad, a lot of folks don't have significant work experience. So you'd encounter all kinds of stuff, extracurricular, just normal life situations that came up in interviews that still elicit the traits that they're looking for. The point is that you have the traits. The point is not that you cured cancer, So that's my 2 cents out there. All right, prep. Okay, so as Ben talked about earlier, you'll be thinking through experiences, ideally experiences, I couldn't agree more with Ben, that cover as many of those as possible so you're not going crazy. Ideally you're focusing on a few experiences that cover a lot of bases that you could use for a lot of different types of questions. And then I meant it when I said write out how you would talk about them in depth. Everyone's different. Everyone's a different type of learner. So I don't want to be overly prescriptive, but I would say 90+% of folks I know who are prepping for these interviews wrote out their answers and their experiences on paper or computers, like completely wrote them out. And specifically, last piece I'll say here, and then I'll give it to Ben, but a common error I saw as an interviewer, and I overheard in interview feedback all the time, is people over focus on context and situation because it's so much easier to talk about. It's like, okay, so there was this person and we were in this place and this other thing was going on. It's like, cool, whatever. Tell me what you did and why it mattered. Like that should be the meat of the story. Don't make the mistake of wasting too much of your precious time on just the backdrop or the wallpaper of the story. You really want the meat to be, what specific action did you specifically take? And I use that word choice intentionally, you. I also heard a lot specifically with women interviews, but lots of interviewees who would say, oh, well, my team did this, or we all did this, or we all did and accomplished this, which is very humble and nice. This is not the time to be humble. This is not the venue for humility. We want to hear about what you, Nathan, or you, Michelle, I want to know like what you specifically did. And it also lands so much stronger. I'll give you an example. Like, oh, you know, our team went to a conference and we presented to 100,000 people versus like, I went to a conference and presented to 100,000 people. It's just punchy, it's strong, it conveys authority and confidence, which is so important for this job. All right, let's see. Oh, Michelle, great question. We'll definitely come back to that. Ben,
Yeah, no,
right,
I think balancing preparation without sounding scripted. Don't worry so much about that. I think get your initial story, understand what the ins and outs of it generally are. And like Missy said, like get the 30-40 second description kind of down pretty pat, like talk through the situation, make sure you are tying it back directly to the question being asked. If you kind of just like launch into a story, like it feels weird. You know when like you talk to somebody in real life, whatever, and they kind of give you this like corporate speak or this like memorized thing back. If ChatGPT could have written it in response, don't use it. Like it should be like, oh, you just asked me about entrepreneurial drive. Awesome. I'm going to talk about like this situation because like I don't necessarily know if I started a business per se, but like when I'm thinking about driving, I'm thinking about finding something from nothing. Here's what comes to mind. Bang, and then say your story. And I think like you won't even have the opportunity to be fully scripted because the interviewer is going to pull you down alleyways that you probably haven't anticipated, and they will be custom creating the actual conversation on the fly. And so I wouldn't worry too much about memorization. I would just focus on like, and again, this is where prep comes in. Like I would focus on like, how does this story work for like 4, 5, 6, 7 scenarios? And by rehearsing it and going through it, you will naturally be flexing it against different question types. And I think that that's what makes the answer like more mature and like more nuanced over time. So use prep, but also like really just stay focused on the main question that they're asking.
yeah, and Michelle, my other 2 cents here. I prefer just writing out bullets because then it isn't quite a script. It's just like, okay, here are these like few points I want to make sure I make, and then the language I might use will be more real time or custom to whatever the specific question was, which in my experience usually just comes across as prepared, but not. I know the next word I was supposed to say. Yeah. Patrick, I see your question here. What's the value of a more heavily good story or good storytelling? So Patrick's question is, some stories lend themselves to being more intriguing and easier to tell, and other stories need a bit of context.
If you need like a preamble before your State of the Union, don't use that story. Like if it's so insanely complicated that you need to like lay out like 5, 6, 7 bullets before actually getting to it, you need to either trim that story down or not use it. Like that's my
yeah. Because and the reason for that is you want to make sure, ultimately this is about making sure you have these traits. And if the interview is spending a bunch of headspace trying to understand context, you're distracting them from the point, which is you're awesome and you have these traits. So let's not waste their bandwidth too much on maybe getting too in depth on. What's your question, Ben? Oh, what I said? This question. Oh, I see.
No,
Sorry.
what does it mean to be using the same setup to answer multiple behavioral questions? That just sounds like a bad idea. I understand where, by the way, none of these questions are bad. I'm just going to tell you if the approach that is being proposed is bad. Because trust me, when I was going through this process, I asked 400 questions that turned out to not yield help for myself or for the people I was working with. So totally get it. You should not be using like the same setup. It should just be tailored to whatever questions being asked. Like if someone were to walk up to you at a bar and ask you like a question about like the most recent thing you did at work, and then you mentioned something from 7 years ago, you wouldn't be answering the question. So just stay present. Don't worry so much about memorization and just like listen to the question, like actually let it land. Take a second. Like one thing my interviewers told me is like, they're like, I like how you actually like took a pause, like after I asked the question and like thought. And I was like, yeah, like I needed to think for 3, 4, 5 seconds, not just to like choose which kind of like experiences I wanted to talk about, but because like, I don't know, I just wanted to be like a regular person and just like talk in return. I get all the pressure, I get where that's coming from. Last thing
Totally.
yeah,
sorry,
I mean,
man. Go ahead.
no worries. This is just because we're on Zoom. I think the last thing I wanted to say here for sure is like really, really want to emphasize, how do you like when you practice, like talk about your stories, talk, like actually say stuff out loud, either with somebody else or be a crazy person. Say them to yourself, say them in the shower. I don't care. Like if you are not saying it out loud, you are literally not practicing to the same degree as you will be practicing on case day by definition. When I started doing that, I started realizing, I kind of hated the way I said that, or like, I wish that rolled off a little bit different. Let me just like make sure I avoid that weird kind of phrase I just used, or that kind of like, I'm creating this like unintentional sentiment that I don't want. I don't want to emphasize this point. I want to emphasize this area and shine the spotlight over here instead. I think that comes more easily through live practice and like speaking aloud.
Definitely. I sometimes will try to tell myself, oh, I don't really need to do that. Come on. It's like, no, I am always glad I did the dress rehearsal, because just you get the kinks out, get the jitters out. It's just good. Same thing with the cases. Like there's something about doing stuff in front of other people that is different, and it's better if you can get those reps in. Always better if you can. There was something else. On the story selection, going back up a little bit to the question of like, what's better, this story or that story? I had a situation where I actually had a couple stories come to mind, and instead of me picking, I said to my interviewer, Rob, I was like, hey, Rob, this actually brings to mind 2 different things. I'm going to describe both of them and then you can pick. I made it a choose your own adventure, which I think he found kind of funny and endearing. I was like, choose your own adventure. I have a story about this and I have another story about this. Which, how do you feel about it? And I think I don't know, which is a good reminder for this interview, the PEI, but also the case. Just don't forget to bring your personality into it, to relax. Like, honestly, when Ben keeps saying like, oh, imagine you're at a bar and someone asks you about this, like people can feel the anxiousness and the nervousness. So I used to kind of mentally trick myself going into these things. I would say, Nezzy, you already have the job. Just act like this is someone you already know who's just talking to you about work stuff. And I think, at least for myself, I think that tricked my headspace and how I talked about it a little bit, just to be more relaxed and be more honest and probably engaging than I would have been otherwise. To the extent that's helpful for anyone. Cool. All right. Let's see. Are there any more questions? I know this is really the meat. You got to treat recruiting like dating. The interview is just a way to get to know each other. Yeah, it's true. It's true. It's about mutual fit. Preston, great question. Sometimes, yes. So if you start into a story and it feels like, as an interviewer, you'll know too. If someone starts to tell a story that you just don't think is going to give you the information you need to assess that trait, you'll ask for a different story. So yes, that does happen. And it's all in your best interest. If they feel like you're starting to tell something that they're not sure is going to get at what they need to get at.
That's a great question as well. And it really leans on the fact that you absolutely want to be answering the question at all times. Do not give me an answer about your genius and your perfectionism and your candor and charisma if I ask you about a weakness. Don't do it. If I ask you about a time when you failed or when things went wrong, do not tell me about something that I can already tell within 3 sentences is going to come around to some resounding success. It is not what I did. I want to understand how you failed, what you learned, and what you did afterwards. But I really also, first and foremost, want to see that you can talk to me about some time that you failed and you came up short. You didn't do the job well. You weren't good enough at something. You screwed up. Like that quality of, yes, you want to be able to talk confidently about your own abilities, exactly what Missy said earlier. But this is the part where like humility in the more traditional sense is actually quite valuable. Because if you don't have this, you won't have the actual ability to admit your mistakes. And if there's something that you're going to do as a consultant more than anything, it's make mistakes. So I think that comes with and derives from this question, Preston. So thank you for asking.
Yeah, agree with that. completely bombed the math in my final round with the partner. And I was like, well, this was fun. Guess I'm not going to be working at McKinsey. And then he was like, no, actually, you totally blew it and you handled blowing it really well. So welcome. I was like, oh shit, never mind. So it's not over till it's over, you know? Okay.
Cool. You want to move to the mock, Missy?
Oh God. Yes. Okay, wait, but first a few tactical tips and then you can grill me. Okay, yes. So I mentioned this one a little bit earlier. I noticed this all the time, more often when I was interviewing women than men, but just something to really pay attention to. People will try to be humble and be like, oh, my team, how are we? And it's like, nope, don't care. What did you do? So make sure you're talking about the specific actions you took. The second one, watch your pace. We all do this when we're nervous. I'm probably doing it right now, but we fly through things when we're on the spot. So just relax. Yeah, they're your friends. They want you to do well. And then I mentioned this one a little bit too. The story, what's most important, as Ben has been saying over and over, is just answering the question's the most important thing. Don't worry about making it the most impressive thing that you've ever done. Just answering the question is what actually matters. And then lastly, expect to be interrupted, which you'll see in spades, probably to some extent with Ben. You might not even get to finish telling your story in the perfect flow that you write out because the interviewer will be really curious and excited to learn more and really dig into it.
Yes, I hope to have the honor to interrupt you over Zoom. It's even harder to do that. So the logic, by the way, there from the interviewer's perspective is we have a limited amount of time. If I notice that this story probably has some meat to it, my job as an interviewer is to do as much as humanly possible to forensically investigate you as an individual and try to understand, like, hey, do you have the traits that we're looking for here? And to give you actually a better opportunity to better use that time. So if you're interrupted, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's us just going, let's gear this somewhere else, or let's try to get this second question. I always emphasize this. You did not have to have grown up in a rural village in Ghana and have 4 startups by the time you're 11 and also have like a Rubik's Cube time of 100 seconds. You're good. Tell your story. I talked about like a school project. Okay. Like it doesn't matter. There's that great saying of like, if is it more impressive for someone in a wheelchair to scale a hill or someone who's fully able to scale Mount Everest? And I don't know, that's up for debate. So don't worry too much about that because we are all based on different opportunity sets and have different resources at our disposal. So
one thing we haven't mentioned yet that I definitely don't want to forget is use different examples. So this is another thing that comes up is if you can use the same examples in 2 different rounds, but in the same round, really try to use different examples if at all possible. It'll be tough if every interview, if we all come back to the room and everyone's like, did everyone hear about the same thing? Oh, that's kind of not great. So make sure you're trying to use different examples where possible.
All right, you ready, Missy?
Good. Yeah, I guess. Oh, wait, we have a couple more chat questions. Saving me. Okay, let's see. Structured thinking. In a way, Arabella, I would say structured in the sense of there's a situation, there are actions that you took, and then there was a result. So structured in that way. I wouldn't worry about saying, I have a story and it has 4 parts. The first part is, don't need to go that far. And let's see, the second one, Jinyu. Does it actually mean I can say, I want to do it with my team? I wouldn't. I would say just make sure you focus on the actions you took. I would say yes, obviously it depends on what the thing is. The question was, can they say I when it was actually something they did with the team? And you definitely can. The point is talking about your actions, and if you took them and it was part of a team, sounds great. Like, as long as you're not, misrepresenting or lying what you did, then
literally
all fair game.
It's a balance, right? Like if you're a banking intern, we know that you're not the one like closing the deal. Like, just relax. But at the same time, like, talk about the discrete value that you added. Talk about what you did to build the model to convince the client to do X. Like, great. Just be very like objective and straightforward about what it is that you're contributing. But I think Missy's point is around like don't undersell it. Don't de-emphasize it. Don't offshore all the credit to somebody else, because we're not hiring your team, we're hiring you.
Yep. Bingo. All right, Ben. If there aren't
Missy,
any more questions. Dang it. All right.
Missy knows one of many questions I may ask her, but doesn't know the specific question I'm going to ask her. So this is exciting.
Good.
Let's see.
Yeah, it's a grain of salt. I didn't do nearly as much prep as we're recommending.
Because I think it's a question that you probably aren't getting in a lot of other interview types, and isn't the type of thing you'll get. Walk me through your resume. Tell me about a time when everything went perfectly. Talk to me about your last job. Like those are questions you're going to get in a lot of other interviews. But I want to know, and we should do this as like a genuine like simulation, right? So so Missy, like I know there's a lot of times when like you've probably been successful. I read through your background, like obviously a ton of awesome accomplishments personally and professionally, but like I kind of want to know specifically about a time when you were either leading a team or part of a team, and you were just working with someone pretty difficult. How did you like navigate that situation? What'd you get from it? Whatever you think is most important to start with.
Great. Thank you for the question, Ben. Yeah, plenty of times. The first thing that comes to mind is this fall. My co-founder and I were in the middle of a fundraise for our startup. It was a really stressful time, and we disagreed fundamentally about how we should spend our product resources in the fall. He really wanted to use them for one thing, and I really wanted to use them for something else. And it got pretty heated. We ultimately needed, I asked him if we could go for a walk in our neighborhood. We lived 3 blocks
What do you
apart.
mean? What do you mean by heated? What does that look like?
It was one of the first times we'd had a fundamental disagreement. And since neither one of us was technically the boss, it was really challenging because there wasn't going to be someone to come in and be the tiebreaker. We disagreed and we had to get to an agreement, and time was of the essence because every second, every day mattered in the fall.
I guess harping on the word heated, but how did that manifest?
It manifested in he would say pretty snarky things.
Okay.
You're so fishing. He would, yeah. It brought out the worst in both of us. We were not particularly kind or gracious with one another. And yeah, so that was the situation.
Did you feel you were reciprocating primarily, or did you feel like this was something that like could have been prevented in any way?
It definitely could have been handled differently. I don't think differences of opinion when building a company can be prevented, but in retrospect, how we should have handled it is getting together in person sooner to talk through something live. We are primarily a remote team, which led to a lot of the disagreement and let it get more heated than it needed to. And so ultimately what I ended up doing was saying, hey, let's meet at our favorite coffee shop and talk live in the morning. We'll have a more productive conversation then. And honestly, I just heard him out to understand, hey, why do you feel so strongly about your perspective?
Here, I want to hear it very much in detail. Like, take me into like that room, take me into the conversation. Like, what's the...
Yeah, totally. We were outside at our favorite coffee shop, Blue Fog. And I just asked him, hey man, can you explain why you feel so strongly about this specific direction? And as he talked me through all those details, it became clear that he, being the product person that he is, he just has really wanted to build a product similar to this other product he loved. And it wasn't necessarily oriented around the objectives that we'd set from the quarter. And me knowing him well enough to know we all could agree on what I was looking for was common ground, and was looking for, okay, what are the things that we do agree on in the situation? And
what do you think he was looking for?
Sorry?
What do you think he was looking for?
He was frustrated. I'd known that the feeling was when you're building something with someone else, it is often not as easy as if you're building it on your own, where you can just make decisions and go. So I know he was frustrated because he didn't understand why I wasn't just saying, yes, that's fine, do that, because this was traditionally his domain, was deciding how we use product resources, versus I was typically focused on growth.
So am I getting this right? That you see his primary motive in that situation is kind of like wanting to be heard, or like getting his frustration out and expressing that to you in a setting that made sense.
Yeah, I think really what it was about was he felt like I was trying to tell him how to do his job. And it clearly, I wasn't looking at it that way. I was looking at it as, oh, we have to spend resources wisely. This isn't an allocation of resources that directly contributes to our stated goals. And that was where the source of the tension came from. But we didn't realize that till we actually got together in person and heard one another. We'd been talking past one another remotely via Slack, over the phone, on Zoom. And it was a huge mistake in retrospect. It should have been something where, as soon as we realized we disagreed, I should have asked for us to meet together in person so I could better understand where he was coming from, leading with curiosity instead of just telling him that I thought the decision didn't make sense.
That said, in fairness, I think probably the line, or at least as much, onus is on him to be asking for the same thing, right? Potentially resolve this thing. So I wouldn't necessarily assume all of the responsibility per se, but I'm curious, stepping back a little bit. Can you talk to me about potentially other stakeholders that were involved, other players, people who might be, thought about in this? It's not just the two of you operating in isolation. So I'm curious how those individuals factored into your equation.
Yeah, definitely. We had a product ops team member who I asked the same week. I said, hey, Phil, can you talk to me a bit about this specific project he wanted to do? Am I missing something? Is there something I'm not understanding about why this is so important? Because I also recognize I might not have the full scope. There might be something I don't understand. And so it was helpful to check in with Phil just to see, hey, am I missing something? Why is this such a priority right now? So yes, that did factor in. And it was helpful for me just to validate that my concern was a valid concern. And then the thing that I did very wrong was, instead of leading with curiosity, finding common ground, and then getting us to water and us drinking water together, I came in and came out with the fact that I disagreed and thought it was the wrong decision. And so going forward, I know now, and I'm always reminded, just to approach situations of disagreement by starting with curiosity and looking for common ground to build from, versus coming out with, hey, I already know I disagree and here's why. Just, it's a lot more likely to be effective and getting the results that I want. And ultimately, on the other side of this situation, we ended up not using the resources how he wanted or how I wanted. We ended up doing something totally different, because when we actually got to talking about what our common ground was, we both realized we were both wrong, and ended up making a better decision for the company. So.
Got it. All right, let's stop it right there.
Sorry, team. Oh
man. For everybody who's on the call, this is exactly the level of intensity you should expect. It's probably a little bit more intense in the real interview for a couple of reasons. One, I'm not smiling in the real interview. Typically, in many cases, I'm just like this the entire time. I'm just talking to you. I'm asking questions. I'm trying to get to the bottom of this, and I may or may not be playing with my own body language in order to make you feel uncomfortable, or have to navigate additional storytelling, or additional answering of my very difficult questions in real time without having the ability to read me. So that's also something you should factor in. But I would love people's thoughts on what they thought Missy did well, what she might have done better. I would be curious, Missy, as folks kind of drop things in chat. And by the way, feel free to be critical, because this would be very, I can screenshot this and then share it with our entire class. So that'll be really, really awesome. So I think, Missy, before I say anything, I'd love your self-assessment.
Yes, I think, there's a lot I could have done better. I didn't set up particularly well.
5 seconds, so that's okay.
That's fair. I, in retrospect, if I were revising my own response, there's information like the fact that we were a remote team, for example, or there's other information that I really should have led with that was important context. And I know I'd said keep context brief, but you definitely want to make sure you get the key structural attributes included when they're relevant to the situation and what's important. And then something I liked was just bringing it back to the question that was asked, which was like a time about a situation where you dealt with a difficult individual or where something was like where there was a conflict, and just being honest about the conflict and focusing the meat about something I was trying to do that I did sort of well, I could have done better. It was just focusing on the actions that I took and what the result was. So that was, let's see, Oscar.
I think he
Oh, cool.
exactly what we were talking about too. Missy, I think the first thing I would lead with, by the way, and just offering my own thoughts as well, just because we have a couple minutes left, you're absolutely hired after this interview. And it's not close.
Thanks, Ben.
That's serious, because it's not close. It's an extremely obvious decision. One of the biggest benefits, and to Oscar's point in the chat, one of the biggest benefits of answering the question in the first sentence is I can spend the entire interview getting into the interesting stuff. I don't have to spend 6 minutes trying to get you to answer the damn question. Missy answered the question with, oh, this was a time when I disagreed with my co-founder about X. Bam. Now we're into all the stuff. This question could have taken 20 minutes, but it took 10 minutes flat, and it was a super dense conversation. Basically, everything Missy offered something new, and was either an insight into how she saw others, how she perceived the world, or how she saw herself. And I thought that every single piece of information was super valid, interesting, and you might find like, the story itself or the story arc relatively straightforward or relatively simple. But I think the combination of self-awareness, the leaning towards what I want to do going forward and how I would change or how I would go back, the honest recollection of both what happened, her own place in the situation, not necessarily like underplaying her level of disagreement or saying that she actually felt somebody else was right. Like, she felt she was right. That's awesome. Cool. And then ultimately like being like, hey, like, I think that this person was thinking X or feeling Y, but I wasn't sure. Here's how we figured it out. Here's the conversation. From an interviewer's perspective, I would just add, like, notice how quickly I just like dove straight in, and I was like, I want to get inside her brain, like, now. I want to understand how she's feeling. I want to understand how she thinks about the feelings of other people. I want to get to the meat of this story. And the phrase, and Missy smiled because I think we've both done this as interviewers, take me into that conversation, is a very deliberately used.
Yeah, exactly. When I was interviewing, I'd be like, yes, okay, wait, where were you? Oh, what time of day? Did you have breakfast? Great. Okay. Stuff that seems so silly, but it's just, you want to be there. You want to paint the picture and just get into the emotions of it and make sure, hey, is this person emotionally intelligent enough to handle it when a client's screaming at them randomly for no reason? Like, that's kind of, also, not actually, but
the bullshit radar is up. Like, if you can't tell me where you were when that conversation happened, bullshit. You did not have that conversation. You're not hired. So the BS radar is also going off as you're doing this. So just remember,
that's
like,
fair. Yeah.
If Missy was telling me I had this really critical conversation, oh, I don't know what state I was in. I'm like, okay, yeah, great. That's awesome. You can go home now, right? So I think, like, all in all, I think that's my only last quick thing I want to add. I actually think this would be my singular piece of improvement for Missy when she's talking about this experience in particular. And it's something I used to do all the time, and I think I still do sometimes. When you're talking about a negative or an emotionally taxing experience, you've obviously picked up on it on this call. Missy is overflowing with charisma and like just general joy for being alive. That sometimes I could feel fading as she was answering the question and kind of reliving the harsh experience. Now, that's not to say recount difficult light moments with a smile and a.
Yeah. Oh no, did we lose Ben? That's okay. Yeah, that was a really shitty experience in the fall, which Ben already knew about. So that's kind of funny. I think you cut out. But wait, if there are any final questions, please throw them in the chat. I'm super pumped to work with anyone on their prep for consulting interviews. Also happy to answer questions one off. Let's see, Oscar. Do interviewers generally pretend to have stricter personality? I certainly didn't. Or I try to just never pretend in general. I might adapt or behave a little more professionally than I am right now, but I think most folks tend to stay somewhere around how they actually are, in part because you'll meet these people and become friends with these people when you join too. So it's kind of strange if they were to totally have a different personality in an interview. I don't know. Ben, do you put on a serious tone?
I don't put on a serious tone. I lean the opposite way. So when I go into an interview, I need to just remember to be like more than 3% polished. You know what I mean? Like be a regular person, like don't drop the F-bomb within like 3 sentences of like starting the interview. That's usually like the kind of stuff I try to tell myself because I'm from Queens. That's how we talk. It's like something I had to think about, I think, in just about every interview setting. It's just like, all right, man, like one button up would be great. So I think it just depends on your style. So that's my thought there.
Also, it looks like we actually have another 13 minutes. So folks, we can certainly ramble more, but want to make sure this is as helpful of a session for you all as possible. So let us know if, yeah, let's see, let's get some topics in here. Nathan, I feel like Ben wanted to drill down to specifics. Okay, let's see. Nathan, good question on just how helpful are specifics. I think, unfortunately, the answer is often it depends, and that's true here too. It just kind of depends. I think you all can be the judge too of like when is a detail actually relevant or not. I would say as an interviewer, I would err on the side of going for just as many specifics as I would need to understand what was going on. I think if it felt like we weren't at a level of specificity where I had a sense for what was happening, I would dig for more. And yeah, Ben, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that one. In short, Nathan, it kind of depends.
Yeah.
But I think the guiding principle is just, yeah, do you need more to understand and assess against the trait or not?
I always would say like you can even ask your interviewer like in the interview, like, is that specific enough? Like, do you want me to go a little bit further into detail? Like throw it back to them and they can tell you like, no, that was good. Or like, I have enough. Let's move on to something else. So don't feel like you can't be a little bit, I don't want to say meta with your interviewer and just like ask them the question about whether or not your answer on a details or a levels basis is actually sufficient. So I think that's totally fine.
Mm-hmm. Elaine here asked, best way to practice PEI besides preparing on your own?
Oh,
I
no.
couldn't agree. What's
I would
that?
say, don't prepare on your own. Prepare with other people.
Yeah, well, prepare on your own first. And then, yes, I could not underscore enough the importance of dress rehearsal. Talking through things out loud. It could be a friend who's also prepping for consulting. It could be anyone in your life who's just willing to listen or give you high level feedback on what made sense or what didn't make sense. In reality, the interview will flow much more like what you saw with Ben and I, where someone's poking around, looking for specific details, kind of on a treasure hunt to assess if you have the trait. But yeah, I would say, Elaine, definitely make sure you're just at a high level describing the situation, actions you took, and result for, let's call it like 3 to 5 situations that cover a lot of those bases with friends and family. That's the general advice I would give is, 3 to 5 stories that ideally cover a lot of bases and knowing those really well. Let's see. Okay. Yeah, go for it.
Panache, I think I'm saying that right. List of, did you think of the potential questions? I think that's a great way to do it. I think there are really a laundry list of potential questions out there, some of which we listed here. Basically, good stuff, bad stuff, unclear stuff. Try to come up with answers to a wide range of situations. And I think map your experiences to the questions that could possibly be asked. Again, Missy's right, like 3 to 5 like meaty stories that have a lot of density to them, I think is usually the way to go. But also another plug here for like working with either coaches or with other friends of yours who like, they're going to ask you, you're just going to naturally run into new questions and other people who have common questions that's common for them, but might be uncommon for you. So I think that's typically the best way to go. Missy, I wanted to emphasize one other thing that I don't know if we talked about, but to the point of like practicing prep, like we've talked a lot about like the variance of prep, and we've talked about the style of prep, and we showed an example. But in terms of the volume, like you should be doing this. I don't want to say as much as cases, but I think like they're weighted equally. Like they're just as important. Like, can you do the job? Do we want you to do the job with us? Like those are pretty critical questions. If you can't answer both with a positive, you're not getting hired. And so I think practicing my stories, I mean, when it came down to the partner round, I didn't even do cases. I was doing all behavioral prep. So my prep up front was probably something like 70-30 for cases, in favor of cases. And then when it went to the partner round, it was probably like 80-20 in favor of behavioral. So really, really making sure you're getting dozens of trial runs in, I think, is the best way to maximize your chances.
Yeah, I would second that, in part because if you think about it, in general, a lot more people are good at cases, and I don't or said differently, it's a lot easier to teach someone how to be better at structured problem solving than it is to teach someone how to handle conflict. So I would say if I had to choose between someone who is weaker on one or the other, I would definitely choose the person who's a little weaker on the case than someone who's a little weaker on interpersonal dynamics. So I agree with Ben, and I notice a lot of folks under prepare on behavioral because the case feels like this foreign enigma. But yeah, definitely don't under prep on this. Let's see. Patrick, if Missy were to have the same interview 5 years down the line, would it be better if she answered the same question with a new conflict?
Hope so.
Yes. Yeah. So I saw that question as well as a question around the how long ago a story could have occurred. More recent is better, generally speaking. I don't know if I'd throw out a specific timeline, but I would say it is kind of odd to me if I ask you about conflict and you tell me a story from 5 years ago. Yeah, it's just kind of odd. I would assume or think there should have been something more recent.
Missy,
Or just make me yeah, go ahead.
I think like one like good like heuristic for people is like, if you're currently an undergrad, don't tell me something from high school. If you've been out of work for into the workforce for a couple of years, don't use something from college. Kind of like these 3-4 year timeframes feel right as the outer bounds.
I agree with that. Michelle, go for it.
From an interviewer perspective, what are immediate red flags that go off whenever somebody, like, what are things that people can do that just automatically set you off?
The first thing that came to mind, Michelle, when you said that was jargon. Like if someone's throwing a bunch of business words at me, I mean, it sounds random. That was just my first thought when you said that, was if someone, I don't know if anyone particularly likes jargon, but I like when people are real with me. Just like talk to me like I'm your friend. The goal of a consultant is to be the trusted partner to a stranger. And so much of it is about building real relationships. And so for me, when I hear lots of jargon and buzzwords, I'm like, are you being real with me? Is this, I don't know. It strikes me as disingenuous.
I have something as well. And some of you may have heard this before, but this is passed around, at least at consulting firms, probably other places too, but like, be polite to everybody. I don't care where you are. I remember like no one I knew growing up done any of these interviews. It meant the world to me, or it was really intimidating for me. And I don't think I necessarily did my best because of it. When I was kind of like in the waiting room or whatever, and just like 1 or 2 people were just kind of snobbish to me for no reason whatsoever. And it was just like, I was just asking them like where they're from or whatever. And the one guy just goes, sorry, man, like, I don't really think I have time for this. And I was just like, what like, what? So I was like, then go sit in a corner, bro. Like, so it was a little bit like the way that you act, other people, being nice to everyone from reception to people you run into in the hallway to the people you're interviewing with. It all goes a long way. And I think taking that attitude with you in life can't hurt either. But I met one guy in the interview waiting room who, in between interviews, who was just really nice. We started laughing. Second interview for both of us went great. Turned out we ended up rooming together in Chicago and both got offers. So You know what I mean? Like little stuff like that. I think like just be good to people around you, bring good energy. As an interviewer, when I notice that that's not the case, or I can kind of get the intel before someone steps into the room, that's not the case. That just really rubs me the wrong way. So that's a big red flag.
Mhm. I am very biased in this. Just like this is more of a green flag, but it's also a little funny because it's something I always do, but just to give folks ideas. You find out who your interviewers are ahead of time, usually. And I think I'm sure they still do that. So I wrote my interviewers handwritten thank you notes ahead of time and left them at the office on my way out. So just planting a seed of like, there are little things you can do. Honestly, sometimes the job becomes about standing out because a lot of really qualified people go through this process and it's really close call a lot of the time, you know, oh, okay. Yeah. And so if there are little things like being kind, doing that extra little small thing, it's memorable. You remember that. And you remember the people who bring personality, not disingenuous personality, but just the people who are their real selves. And yeah, it just makes it a lot more memorable than folks who just, you know, do all the prep and do everything right.
Sanjana has a really good question. Finding commonality with the interviewer. I have a simple way of doing this. Ask them, you know, there's limited time during the behavioral, but there may be like 3 to 5 minutes at the end. I think asking them a simple kind of like positive oriented question at the end of the interview, like, hey, it's like, talk to me honestly, like curious, like, how are you liking it? Like, what are your favorite parts about the job? Like, where do you see yourself going? Like, I'm curious as somebody who knows like, you know, half as much as you would about this time to roll. Like, talk to me about that. I would love to hear more. Just a simple question that leans positive. Like, don't try to like stump your interviewer with some crazy question, but like, if you also saw something in their background, be like, hey, by the way, I noticed that like we both do this. I'm curious, like, you know, what your experience is. We'd love to chat with you, like about this, blah, blah, blah. Like, just find like, again, that homework beforehand, if possible, do that. And definitely do that if you can, if possible. But I think like in general, like also be listening. Your interviewer will be throwing in little nuggets, like people's personalities, like they leak out of themselves. So like, just listen, like it'll be worth it.
Mm-hmm. And yeah.
Maybe flip to the last slide there, Missy. I think we should have one more slide.
Oh, just that one.
Oh, it's just us. Okay.
That's awkward. Let's see. I wouldn't, someone just asked about bringing up something you found on LinkedIn. I wouldn't bring it up. Seems a little, yeah. Someone said earlier that interviewing is kind of like dating. Same rules apply here. I'd be like, hey, so when I was stalking you on the internet before our date, I found out. Yeah. You don't want to do that. Let's see.
Missy, I think we're at the hour.
I know. I wanted to answer Jason's real quick. To recycle a larger story.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just try to use different examples where you can. It's okay if it's at the same company, but just don't use the same story.
They'll know.
If that makes sense. Yeah, it'll come up when we all debrief.
Last thing for us, Missy, I think just worth saying, like behavioral cases, like Missy and I both do a lot of this stuff. I think feel free to reach out. Also, like Leland's just full of like awesome coaches who do a wide variety of things. If you're like scrolling through a bunch of us and you're like, hey, like would love to know if this would be a good person to work with on X, like I'm more than happy to field questions on this type of thing. But behavioral is also something that sometimes requires as much, if not more practice than casing. So I highly recommend like just staying attuned to how much prep's actually needed and getting to work as soon as you can.
Awesome. Thank you all for joining. Thank you, Erica, for organizing.
Yes, thank you.
You rock. And hope everyone has a great week.
And thank you so much for everybody who engaged. Like, just really appreciate the great questions here and hopefully help bust a few myths out here.
Yeah.